What if the boy who grew up in a log cabin with nothing, no money, no privilege, not even proper schooling, could rise to become the President of the United States? Sometimes life feels unfair. You might look at your circumstances, poverty, rejection, endless struggles, and wonder if success is even possible. But history reminds us, greatness often rises from the hardest soil. Abraham Lincoln's story proves that no matter where you start, your ending can change the world. Picture a young boy in the wilderness of Kentucky. His home, a tiny log cabin with dirt floors. His father could not offer him wealth, and his mother passed away when he was just 9 years old. Pain, loss, and poverty marked his childhood. Yet, young Abraham had something no one could take away. Hunger, not for food, but for learning. He borrowed books, reading by firelight late into the night, teaching himself words that would one day move nations. But his journey wasn't smooth. He faced countless failures, businesses collapsed, elections lost, heartbreak that left him shattered. People doubted him, mocked his appearance, even called him unfit for politics. Yet he refused to quit. Through each failure, he grew stronger. Through every rejection, he learned resilience. And when the nation itself was divided, torn apart by slavery and war, Lincoln's voice, calm, steady, and filled with conviction, guided America through its darkest hours. From poverty to presidency, his life teaches us this. It doesn't matter where you begin. What matters is how fiercely you rise. The night was unforgiving. A cold December wind swept across the Kentucky wilderness, rattling the wooden planks of a small log cabin that stood alone in the darkness. The cabin wasn't much, rough timbers stacked together, a dirt floor beneath, and a thin chimney that puffed out smoke like a weak heartbeat against the endless night. Inside, a flickering fire struggled to fight the icy air, its glow casting shadows that danced across the worn walls. Every creak of the wind pressing against the cabin felt like a reminder. Life here was not meant to be easy. Inside this fragile shelter, Nancy Hanks Lincoln lay on a straw mattress, her face pale with exhaustion, her body trembling with both the chill and the pain of labor. She was young, not yet 30, but years of hardship had already carved lines of fatigue into her skin. Beside her, Thomas Lincoln, her husband, tried to keep calm, pacing with a mixture of fear and helplessness. He was no doctor, no healer, just a farmer, a carpenter, a man trying to hold his family together in the unforgiving frontier. The midwife, an older woman from a nearby settlement, whispered soft words of encouragement, her weathered hands moving with practiced care. Outside, the howling wind carried the sound of wolves in the distance, as if nature itself was testing the courage of this small family. The log cabin creaked, but inside, all attention was fixed on the moment that would decide not just a family's future, but, though no one could know it then, the destiny of a nation. Nancy let out a cry, sharp and raw, echoing against the wooden beams. Then silence, broken only by the thin, fragile cry of a newborn child. The midwife lifted the baby, his skin red from the cold, his small chest heaving as he drew his first breath in a world that had given him nothing but struggle from the very beginning. Thomas leaned forward, his rough hands trembling as he touched the tiny forehead. His son, his boy, Abraham. There was no wealth to welcome him, no luxury, no golden cradle or silk blankets, only a ragged quilt, a flickering fire, and the love of parents who could offer little more than their hopes. Yet, in that moment, as the wind howled outside and the wolves cried into the night, something greater stirred in the air. The world did not notice. It was just another poor child born in the wilderness, but history had quietly turned a page. The baby's first cry cut through the silence of the Kentucky woods like a promise that greatness could rise from the humblest soil, that leadership could be born in poverty, that the future of America could begin in a cabin smaller than most barns. Thomas held his newborn close to the fire, whispering words the child could never hear. "You'll have to be strong, son. Stronger than me. Stronger than the world." His voice cracked, but his grip was steady, as though he already sensed the weight his son would one day carry. And so, on that bitter winter night in 1809, in a log cabin barely big enough to hold the family within it, Abraham Lincoln entered the world, not as a president, not as a leader, but as a poor boy in the wilderness. The wind roared outside, but inside, hope had been born. The fire crackled faintly, its flames licking at the edges of half-burnt logs, sending shadows sliding across the rough cabin walls. The smell of damp wood, sweat, and earth filled the air, mixing with the sharp metallic scent of blood. Outside, the wind battered the roof with the persistence of an uninvited guest, howling through the cracks as if it too wanted to witness what was happening inside. But in that dim, cramped room, the world seemed to hold its breath. Nancy Hanks Lincoln's face was drenched in sweat, her eyes squeezed shut as she clutched the quilt beneath her. The pain came in waves, each one tearing through her frail body like a storm across the plains. Her breaths were shallow, sharp, echoing louder than the crackle of the fire. Beside her, Thomas Lincoln knelt, his calloused hands gripping hers. He whispered words that were more for himself than for her. "Just a little longer. You can do this. God help us." His voice breaking under the weight of his helplessness. The midwife leaned closer, her hands steady, her gaze sharp. She had seen births before, too many in cabins just like this one, too many where life slipped away before it even began. She gave instructions in hushed tones, urging Nancy to push, urging Thomas to hold steady. The air inside the cabin grew heavy, thick with anticipation and fear. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the silence cracked open. A small, piercing sound cut through the room, a fragile, desperate cry that carried more strength than its size should allow. Abraham Lincoln's first cry filled the cabin, sharp and high, echoing against the wooden beams as though the world itself was taking notice. For a moment, the howling of the wind faded. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. Thomas's eyes widened, wet with relief. His chest heaved as though he had been holding his breath for hours. He reached forward, his large hands trembling as the midwife wrapped the baby in a coarse cloth and handed him over. The child was tiny, his skin flushed red, his fists clenched as he wailed against the cold air of the world that had so roughly welcomed him. Nancy's eyes fluttered open. She was exhausted, her body trembling, but when she saw the small bundle placed gently against her chest, a faint smile broke across her lips. Her hand, thin and weak, moved slowly, brushing against the newborn's cheek. "Abe," she whispered softly, her voice barely audible over the baby's cries. It was not just a name. It was a prayer, a hope, a quiet plea that this child would survive in a world where so many did not. The first cry of Abraham Lincoln was not just a sound, it was a declaration. A voice rising from the poorest of beginnings, a voice that one day would grow to move millions, to echo in the halls of power, to heal a nation torn apart. But on that night, it was simply the cry of a hungry, cold child, reminding his parents that life, fragile and precious, was present in their arms. Thomas held his son carefully, afraid his rough hands might harm the small, squirming body. He lifted him closer to the fire, the glow reflecting in his tired eyes. The baby's cries grew louder, filling every corner of the cabin. For Thomas, those cries were not a burden. They were music, proof that his son had entered the world alive, strong, fighting. In that moment, poverty didn't matter. The broken roof, the empty pantry, the endless struggle of frontier life, all faded beneath the sound of that cry. Nancy whispered again, her voice weak but steady. "He will be something. I know it." The midwife, though hardened by years of witnessing life and death, paused at those words. Something in the way the child's cries rang out, unyielding, unafraid, made her believe it too, if only for an instant. She adjusted the cloth around him, ensuring he was warm, before stepping back into the shadows, letting the family breathe in this fragile miracle. The night outside remained merciless. The wolves still howled in the distance. The wind still tore through the trees. But inside the cabin, everything had changed. The cry of a newborn boy had carved out a pocket of warmth against the cold, a spark of hope against despair. The fire crackled again, brighter this time, as if in celebration. And in that flickering light, Abraham Lincoln's tiny face, red and wrinkled, glowed with the promise of a future no one could yet imagine. The storm outside had not eased. The wind screamed against the wooden cabin, like a beast trying to claw its way in. The roof shuddered with each gust, and cold air slipped through the cracks in the timbers. brushing against the skin of those huddled within. Yet, inside the cabin, for the first time in hours, silence settled. A silence not of emptiness, but of awe. The newborn had finally stopped crying, his small chest rising and falling with the shallow rhythm of sleep, his face pressed gently against his mother's chest. Nancy lay back on the straw mattress, her body trembling with exhaustion, her eyes half closed. Every muscle ached, every breath was heavy, but her heart was steady. She could feel the fragile weight of her son against her, his warmth a quiet miracle in the cold of the night. Her thin lips curved into a faint smile. She whispered something only she could hear, words of gratitude, words of hope. Thomas sat near the fire, his broad shoulders slumped, his face buried in his hands. The flickering light revealed a man torn between pride and fear. He had seen too many winters, too many graves dug in frozen ground. Life on the frontier was merciless. Children did not always live long. Mothers often didn't survive childbirth. He rubbed his hands over his tired face and glanced at his wife and son, his eyes glassy with something he rarely allowed himself to feel, vulnerability. The cabin was small, barely a single room. The walls were rough-hewn logs, uneven, with gaps stuffed with clay and mud that cracked in the cold. The floor was nothing more than packed earth, hard and damp beneath their feet. In one corner sat a crude wooden table, on which a single candle burned low. Beside it, a few wooden chairs, one missing a leg and propped up by a stone. Every object in the room spoke of struggle, of poverty that clung to them like a second skin. And yet, that night, the cabin felt sacred, transformed by the presence of new life. The midwife moved quietly, gathering cloths, rinsing her hands in a small bowl of cold water. She glanced at the child with a practiced eye, nodding in satisfaction at his steady breathing. She had seen too many stillborn infants, too many lifeless bundles, handed to mothers, whose tears filled cabins like rivers. Tonight was different. Tonight, life had won its battle, at least for now. The silence deepened. Even the fire seemed to soften its crackle, as though it too respected the fragility of the moment. Thomas finally rose, his heavy boots creaking against the dirt floor. He walked toward Nancy, kneeling beside her. His rough hand brushed a damp strand of hair from her forehead. "You're strong," he murmured, his voice gravelly, thick with emotion. Nancy opened her eyes and met his gaze. "He's strong," she whispered back, her voice barely audible. Thomas looked down at his son. The baby's tiny fist twitched in sleep, his lips parted slightly, his breathing soft and even. In that fragile bundle, Thomas saw not just a child, but a reflection of his own struggles, born into hardship, destined to fight for every step forward. He bent down, pressing his forehead lightly against his son's. "You'll have to be tougher than me, Abe," he said softly. "The world out there, it doesn't give mercy." Outside, the wolves howled again, their cries carried by the storm. The sound seeped into the cabin, a reminder of the wilderness pressing close on every side. But the baby did not stir. His silence was unbroken, his tiny body wrapped in warmth. The wolves could not touch him here. Not tonight. Nancy's eyelids grew heavy. She fought against sleep, unwilling to let go of the moment. She wanted to memorize every detail, the sound of his breathing, the weight of him against her, the way the firelight softened his features. She whispered again, this time louder, so that Thomas could hear. "He will do more than survive. He will matter." Thomas didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat tightened, and his chest ached with emotions he couldn't name. He simply nodded, his eyes fixed on his son, as though trying to burn the image into memory. The midwife, having finished her quiet duties, gathered her things. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and glanced once more at the small family before stepping toward the door. "He's strong," she said softly, almost to herself. Then she opened the door, and the wind roared in, cold and sharp. She slipped out into the storm, closing the door behind her, leaving the family alone in their silence. The fire's glow dimmed, shadows stretching longer across the cabin walls. The baby stirred faintly, a small sigh escaping his lips before he sank back into the depths of sleep. The silence of the cabin wrapped around them all, fragile, sacred, unbroken. It was in that silence that a destiny began to take shape, though none of them could yet see it. And so, in the quiet heart of a winter storm, in a cabin smaller than a stable, the future of a nation lay cradled in a mother's arms, sleeping peacefully against the sound of the storm. The cabin was poor, but that night it was enough. The cabin had grown quieter as the night deepened, but for Thomas Lincoln, silence was no comfort. He sat by the fire, his shadow stretched long against the rough log walls, his rough hands clasped together so tightly the knuckles shone white. His son slept in Nancy's arms, his tiny breath steady, his fragile body wrapped in the coarse quilt. The child looked peaceful, almost untouched by the harsh world outside. But Thomas knew better. He had lived long enough to understand that peace was a fleeting illusion in the Kentucky wilderness. The father's burden weighed heavily on him. Each gust of wind rattling the cabin reminded him of the fragility of his family shelter. Each distant howl of a wolf or crack of a tree branch outside whispered of dangers waiting just beyond the walls. And each glance at the newborn, his skin pale and soft, reminded Thomas of the responsibility now carved into his very bones, to protect, to provide, to prepare this child for a world that had offered Thomas himself so little. He stared into the fire, watching as sparks leapt upward and vanished into the smoky air. The flames were alive, fierce and fleeting, much like life itself on the frontier. He thought of his own struggles, years of toil in rocky soil, the endless labor of splitting rails and building shelters, of moving from one piece of land to another, always chasing stability that never lasted. Poverty was not new to him. It was the air he breathed, the ground beneath his boots. But now, with a son in his arms, poverty felt heavier, more merciless. Nancy stirred weakly on the straw mattress, adjusting the baby against her chest. Her eyes flicked toward Thomas, and for a moment, he saw in them the reflection of his own fears. She was strong. God knew she had endured more than most women ever should. But she was also fragile, her body worn thin from hardship, her health uncertain. What if she could not endure? What if one day she was gone, and it was only him and the boy against the wilderness? The thought tightened his chest until he could barely breathe. He rose from the fire and walked slowly to the cabin door. His boots crunched softly against the dirt floor, the cold draft seeping through the cracks brushing against his skin. He pressed a hand against the wooden doorframe, rough and splintered beneath his touch. Beyond it lay darkness, an endless stretch of woods, cold, wild, and unforgiving. That was the world his son had been born into. Not the safety of a town, not the comfort of wealth, but the raw, untamed wilderness where only the strongest survived. Thomas opened the door a crack. The night air rushed in, cold enough to sting his skin, sharp enough to make him shiver. He gazed out into the black forest, the branches bending under the weight of winter wind, the moonlight faint against the clouds. Somewhere out there, a wolf howled, low and mournful. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Not him," he whispered to himself, his voice rough. "Not my boy. He'll live. He'll fight." He closed the door quietly, leaning against it for a moment as though holding back the wilderness itself with the strength of his body. When he turned back, his eyes fell on Nancy and the child again. His heart ached at the sight. So beautiful, so fragile, so utterly unprepared for what life would demand. But inside that ache was a fire, a vow forming deep within him. No matter how poor, no matter how hungry, no matter how hard the earth beneath his hands, he would not fail his son. Thomas moved back toward the fire, sinking onto the wooden stool. He pulled out his small axe, the blade dull from use, and ran his thumb across its edge. This was his life, wood, sweat, and survival. He had no books to offer, no fine clothes, no riches. But he had his labor, his strength, his will. Perhaps that would be enough to keep his family alive. Perhaps that would be the foundation on which his son could build something greater. The baby stirred, letting out a small whimper before falling back into silence. Thomas watched closely, his breath caught until the child settled again. The sound pierced him deeper than any wolf's howl. This was not just another mouth to feed. This was the continuation of his blood, his name, his legacy. He felt both pride and fear. Pride that the boy was his. Fear that the world might break him before he had a chance to stand tall. Nancy's voice came softly, breaking the silence. He'll need more than work, Thomas. Thomas turned, frowning slightly. What do you mean? She looked down at the baby, brushing a finger along his tiny arm. He'll need a mind, knowledge, words. You give him strength, yes, but he'll need more than muscle to survive what's ahead. Her words were faint, but they carried a weight that pressed into Thomas's chest. He had never been much for books. He could barely read himself, his world shaped more by axes and hammers than ink and paper. But in that moment, as he looked at his son, he understood what Nancy meant. Strength built walls. Words moved nations. The fire burned lower, the cabin sinking deeper into shadows. Thomas placed the axe back against the wall and rubbed his weary hands together. He was not a man of words. He was not a man of vision, but perhaps his son could be. And if that was to happen, then Thomas would carry his burden without complaint. He would carry it so that his son might carry something greater. The wolves cried again in the distance, but Thomas no longer flinched. He looked at the sleeping child and whispered under his breath, "You'll outlive them all." The cabin's silence returned, heavy but resolute, and in that silence, the father's burden settled, not as despair, but as a promise. The fire had burned low, leaving only glowing embers that pulsed faintly in the hearth like the last heartbeat of the night. The room smelled of wood smoke, sweat, and damp earth, a reminder that the cabin was more survival than home. Nancy Hanks Lincoln lay propped against the rough wall, her body weak, her skin pale from exhaustion, yet her eyes, soft, deep, and unwavering, were fixed on the fragile bundle she held against her chest. The child's breaths were small clouds of warmth, his tiny fingers curling around nothing but air. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of timber as the winter wind pressed against the cabin. Thomas had drifted into a restless doze near the fire, his broad frame slumped forward, his chin resting on his chest. His hand still clutched the handle of the axe, as if even in sleep he could not release the weight of his responsibility. But Nancy remained awake. Something in her heart would not let her close her eyes. She looked down at the child, studying the soft roundness of his face, the delicate lashes that trembled with each tiny breath. Her lips moved silently at first, shaping words she had whispered many times before, prayers born not of ritual, but of desperation. Tonight, though, her prayer carried more urgency. Tonight, the weight of her son's fragile life pressed down on her chest like a stone. "O Lord," she whispered finally, her voice a breath in the stillness, "watch over him." The words wavered, trembling with both exhaustion and determination. She swallowed hard, her hand brushing over the quilt that wrapped the baby. "I have so little to give him. No riches, no books, no future carved in safety. Only love and hope and faith in you." Her throat tightened as she spoke. She thought of her own life, the hardships that had marked her years, losing her mother when she was a child, the hunger that had gnawed through winters, the endless labor that had hardened her hands. She had known loss. She had known despair. But as she held her son, she prayed with a fierceness that surprised even her. "Spare him from the darkness, Lord. Spare him from the hunger, the sickness, the graves that come too soon. Let him live." The child stirred faintly, a soft whimper escaping his lips, and Nancy's heart clenched. She pressed him closer, her warmth a shield against the cold air that crept through the cracks in the logs. Her tears fell silently, tracing paths down her cheeks, landing softly on the quilt. "If you take me, Lord, let him remain. If you test me, let him grow strong. And if he is meant for something, if he is meant for more than this cabin, this soil, this struggle, then give him the strength to walk that road." Her voice broke, but she continued. The prayer was not rehearsed. It was not polished. It was raw, spoken between breaths, stitched together with desperation and love. Let him speak truth when others speak lies. Let him stand tall when others bow. Let him bring light where there is shadow. Even if I never live to see it, let his life matter. She closed her eyes briefly, her lips trembling as more tears came. She thought of the world outside the cabin, the cruel winters, the endless work, the harshness of survival. It seemed impossible to imagine greatness rising from such poverty. And yet, Looking at her son, she could not shake the feeling that he was different, that his cry earlier had not just been a sound, but a declaration, that the silence he now held was not emptiness, but strength waiting to be born. The fire cracked suddenly, startling her. She looked up, watching as a spark leapt into the air before fading into ash. She thought of that spark, small and fleeting, and prayed her son would not be like that, burning briefly before vanishing. She prayed he would endure, a fire that would not be extinguished. Her voice grew softer, almost a lullaby as she whispered, "Guide him, Lord. Guide him when I cannot. Teach him what I cannot teach. Make him into more than his father, more than me. Let him rise." The baby shifted again, this time sighing softly before settling back into sleep. Nancy smiled faintly through her tears, brushing a finger across his forehead. "That's your first prayer, Abe," she whispered, her voice tender. "It will follow you, even if you never hear it." Behind her, Thomas stirred in his chair, muttering in his sleep, his hand tightening on the axe. Nancy glanced at him, her heart aching with both love and worry. He carried his burden quietly, but she knew how heavy it was. She knew the weight of poverty, the fear of failure, the exhaustion of endless labor. Yet she also knew his strength, his resilience. If her son carried even a piece of that strength, perhaps he would survive. The wind howled again outside, pressing against the cabin with a force that made the walls tremble. But inside, Nancy's prayer lingered in the air, a shield stronger than wood or stone. It was invisible, unmeasurable, but real. She believed it would follow her son for all his days, guiding him even when she could no longer hold him. Her eyes finally grew heavy. She kissed the baby's forehead gently, her lips lingering as though sealing the prayer into his skin. Then, still holding him close, she allowed her body to rest. The fire's glow dimmed further, shadows stretching long and deep. But in the stillness of that night, a mother's prayer had been set loose into the world, one that would carry through time, shaping a destiny no one could yet see. The first light of morning crept slowly across the Kentucky wilderness, a pale gray seeping through the cracks in the log cabin. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a stillness that was not peace but aftermath. The trees outside stood heavy with frost, their branches sagging like weary shoulders. The ground, hard and unyielding, glistened with ice. Winter had not relented. It had only paused long enough to remind those who lived in its shadow that survival was never guaranteed. Inside the cabin, the cold was sharper than ever. The fire had burned down to ash, leaving only faint wisps of smoke curling upward from blackened logs. The air bit at exposed skin, stiff and cruel, pressing against lungs with every breath. Thomas stirred first, waking with a start as his back ached from sleeping slumped in the wooden chair. His axe lay across his lap, his fingers still curled around the handle, as though even in sleep he refused to surrender his guard. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the pale light filtering into the room, and the first thing he looked for was his family. Nancy lay curled on the mattress, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale but calm. The baby was still nestled in her arms, swaddled tightly in the quilt, his tiny face peeking out from the folds. His breaths came steady, faint clouds of warmth against the cold. Thomas exhaled, a slow breath of relief, before rising carefully from the chair. His joints cracked, his body stiff from labor and worry. He stretched briefly, then moved to stir the fire, trying to coax life back into the embers. But the wood pile beside the hearth was almost empty, only a few small logs remaining. That was the harsh truth of frontier life. Every morning began with labor. Hunger did not wait. Cold did not wait. Life did not pause for joy or grief. Thomas knew this, had lived this truth every day of his life. But that morning, the burden felt heavier, because now the cost of failure was not just his own survival, it was his son's. He pulled on his worn boots and stepped quietly to the door. The moment he opened it, a blast of icy wind cut into the room, making Nancy stir and tighten her arms around the baby in her sleep. Thomas grimaced, pulling his coat tighter around him before stepping out into the dawn. The world outside was brutal in its beauty. The fields were a sheet of frost, sparkling under the weak light of the rising sun. The trees creaked under the weight of ice. In the distance, The faint tracks of animals marked the snow, reminders that hunger prowled even in silence. Thomas's breath clouded in the air as he moved toward the small woodpile he had stacked the week before. The logs were damp, frozen at the edges, but they would have to do. He gathered as many as he could carry, his arms straining, his breath quickening in the freezing air. As he worked, his mind replayed the night before, the cries of his wife, the sound of his son's first breath, the fragile silence that had followed. He had felt both joy and fear, pride and dread. This child was his blood, his legacy. But would he live long enough to see the boy grow? Would the land, harsh and unforgiving, allow it? Or would his son be like so many others Thomas had buried, names carved in crude wooden crosses that the wilderness swallowed too soon? He set the wood by the door and paused, his hands raw from the cold, his breath sharp in his lungs. He looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to rise. It was not warm. It was not kind. But it was steady, pushing back the darkness bit by bit. He thought of his son again, sleeping in the warmth of the cabin. Perhaps the boy, too, would grow steady like that sun, enduring through winters, pushing back darkness in ways Thomas could not yet imagine. Back inside, the cabin stirred with life. Nancy's eyes opened slowly, her body weak but her spirit unbroken. She looked down at her son and smiled faintly. "He's warm," she asked softly as Thomas entered, carrying the wood. Thomas nodded, kneeling to place the logs into the hearth. Soon the flames flickered back to life, chasing shadows into the corners. Nancy shifted, wincing slightly, and whispered, "He'll need more than firewood, Thomas." Her words carried the same weight as her prayer the night before, though softer, more fragile. Thomas didn't respond at first. He simply placed another log on the fire and watched as it caught flame. His jaw tightened, his mind echoing with her words. He knew she was right. Firewood would keep them alive today. But tomorrow, and the day after, and the years that stretched beyond, what then? The baby stirred, letting out a small cry that pierced the quiet. Nancy hushed him gently, rocking him with soft whispers. Thomas turned, watching them, his chest heavy with both love and fear. He had seen too much of the world to believe it would offer kindness. But in that moment, watching his son's tiny fists wave against the air, he allowed himself to believe in something he rarely let himself feel: hope. The dawn outside was harsh, cold, and unyielding. But inside the cabin, against the odds, there was warmth. There was life. And there was the beginning of something greater than Thomas or Nancy could yet see. The day had begun, as all days did, with work and burden. But for the first time, it also began with the fragile weight of destiny sleeping in a log cabin. The fire crackled softly, its flames licking upward as though desperate to prove they could hold back the cold that pressed against the cabin walls. It was not much, a fragile hearth built from rough stones Thomas had stacked himself, but it was all they had. The smoke curled upward into the chimney, leaving behind the faint smell of burning pine that clung to the air. For Nancy, still weak from childbirth, the warmth was a comfort, a small shield against the brutal Kentucky winter. She lay back against the thin mattress, the baby cradled in her arms. His face, tiny and red, was turned toward her, his mouth searching for milk, his fists curling and uncurling with fragile determination. She brushed her lips against his forehead, whispering words only he could hear, words of comfort, promises of protection. In her eyes burned a fierce devotion, but beneath it lingered fear. She had buried children before. She knew how swiftly life could slip away. Thomas moved about the cabin with heavy steps, carrying wood, adjusting the fire, checking the gaps in the walls, where wind sometimes whistled through. He said little, but his silence was not cold, it was burdened. Every gesture, every glance at his son, carried the weight of a vow he had not spoken aloud, that he would keep them safe, no matter the cost. The baby let out a sharp cry, high and insistent, cutting through the room. Nancy hushed him, rocking gently. Thomas paused, staring. That sound, it was fragile, almost weak, but it filled the cabin with life. In a land where silence often meant death, the cry of a newborn was a defiance, a declaration that he had arrived and would not be ignored. Outside, dawn had given way to day, though the sky was still a dull gray. heavy with the promise of more snow. The wilderness waited just beyond the cabin walls, vast and unforgiving. Every creak of branches in the wind reminded Thomas that nature cared nothing for human struggle. The hearth inside was fragile, the walls thin, but they were all that stood between his family and the void outside. Nancy's voice broke the silence. "He's strong," she whispered, looking down at her son. "Stronger than he looks." Thomas nodded, though he kept his eyes on the fire. "He'll have to be," he said quietly. They both knew the truth. Strength was not a choice here. It was survival. Children who were not strong enough did not see their first spring. Families who were not prepared lost everything to the hunger of winter. The fire could not be allowed to die, not even for a moment. The hearth was fragile, but it was the center of their hope. Hours passed slowly, marked by the rhythm of the baby's cries, the crackle of the fire, and the occasional howl of wind outside. Thomas left briefly to fetch more wood, his axe slung across his shoulder, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. Each step reminded him of the endless labor that frontier life demanded. There was no room for weakness, no space for rest. Yet, as he chopped logs beneath the gray sky, he felt a strange resolve stirring within him. His son's cry still echoed in his ears, sharper than the crack of his axe. That cry, he realized, was a kind of promise. It meant the child would fight to stay, and Thomas would fight alongside him. Back in the cabin, Nancy fed the baby, humming softly as she did. The tune was old, one her mother had sung to her when she was a girl, a lullaby carried through generations. It was a fragile thread of memory, binding past to present. She wondered if her son would remember her songs one day, if he would carry them in his heart even after she was gone. By evening, the cabin glowed faintly with firelight. The baby slept at last, his tiny chest rising and falling steadily. Nancy closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her, but she smiled faintly as she drifted. Thomas sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. He added another log, refusing to let the hearth weaken. The wilderness pressed close, the night colder than the morning had been. Wolves howled faintly in the distance, a reminder of the predators that prowled unseen. But inside the cabin, against all odds, there was warmth. A fragile hearth, a fragile family, and the fragile but undeniable beginning of a story that would one day change the world. Thomas stared at his son once more before whispering into the silence. "Live. That's all I ask of you now. Just live." And in that fragile prayer, the fire seemed to burn brighter. The first real trial came sooner than Thomas or Nancy had expected. Winter, though already harsh, turned cruel within days. The temperature plunged lower, and the winds that once whispered through the trees now screamed like banshees against the walls of the cabin. Snow piled higher each morning, burying the path Thomas had cut through the forest, sealing them off from the outside world. Inside, the fire never slept. It could not. Thomas had become its sentinel, feeding it constantly with what he'd hauled in from the woodshed. Yet even with his vigilance, there were moments when the flames shrank too low, moments when the bitter cold crept inside, biting at their skin, numbing their hands. The baby felt it most of all. His tiny frame shivered despite the layers of cloth Nancy wrapped around him. Each cry pierced Nancy's heart. She rocked him, sang to him, pressed him close, but she knew that warmth was his greatest need. And warmth depended on Thomas, on the fire, on the fragile balance between endurance and exhaustion. One night, when the storm was at its worst, Thomas ventured outside to gather more wood. The snow blinded him, stinging his eyes, numbing his beard into stiff icicles. Each step felt like a battle against the earth itself, his boots sinking into drifts that rose nearly to his knees. He hacked at frozen logs with his axe, the sound dull against the storm's howl. His arms ached, his breath came in clouds that froze in the air, but he pressed on. Every swing of the axe was a thought of his family inside, his wife's tired eyes, his son's fragile body. They could not survive without the fire, and the fire could not survive without him. Inside the cabin, Nancy prayed. She whispered desperate words into the dark, her voice trembling as much as her hands. "Lord, don't take him," she said as she held her son to her chest. "Not this one. Let him live." She remembered her other children, buried in the frozen ground not far from here. Each loss had carved her heart into pieces she thought could never mend. But now, with this child, there was a new spark, a fragile, trembling hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. When Thomas returned, his coat caked with snow, his arms heavy with wood, Nancy looked up at him with tear-filled eyes. He said nothing, only set to work stoking the fire. Sparks flew upward, and slowly, the flames grew strong again, casting a golden glow across the cabin. The baby stirred in his mother's arms, then let out a cry, weak but steady. Nancy smiled through her tears. To her, that cry was not a burden, but a victory. It meant he still had strength enough to fight. Days blurred together. The storm raged without end, the world outside buried in white. Inside, time was measured by the baby's cries, the crack of Thomas's axe, the songs Nancy whispered. Their lives became a cycle of endurance, each moment a choice to keep going. On one particularly brutal morning, when the cold seemed determined to seep into their bones, Nancy noticed something new. Her son's eyes, though small and clouded with newborn haze, seemed to focus, just for a moment, on the flickering firelight. It was as though he, too, understood its importance, as though he recognized that flame as the boundary between life and death. She pressed a kiss to his forehead and whispered, "That's right, little one. Keep your eyes on the fire. It will see us through." The trial of that winter was not a single event, but a relentless siege. Hunger pressed against them when their supplies ran low. Fear gnawed at them when wolves howled too close at night. Fatigue threatened to break Thomas as he worked without rest. But through it all they endured. Each sunrise was proof of survival, each day a small miracle. One night, when the storm finally eased, Thomas stepped outside. The world was quiet, muffled beneath blankets of snow that glittered beneath a pale moon. He stood there, breath clouding the air, his axe in hand, and for the first time in weeks, he felt the stillness of victory. Against all odds, they had survived the worst of it. When he returned inside, he found Nancy humming softly, the baby asleep against her chest. The fire burned bright, its glow warm and steady. For the first time, Thomas allowed himself a small smile. He knelt beside the cradle they had fashioned out of scrap wood and whispered to his son, "The storm tried to take you, but you stayed. That's how I know you were meant for more." The baby stirred, his tiny fist curling as though in agreement. And so, in that small cabin, in the heart of a Kentucky winter, the first trial was endured. It was not the last, nor the greatest, but it set the pattern for the life ahead. Hardship met with endurance, pain met with quiet strength. A life that began in a fragile log cabin would one day carry the weight of a nation. But for now, he was only a child, fragile, small, yet undefeated. The storm had finally loosened its grip on the Kentucky wilderness, but the chill lingered. Snow still pressed against the cabin walls, and frost painted the edges of the single window pane in delicate, icy veins. Inside, the fire glowed low and steady, filling the room with its faint, crackling music. Nancy Hanks cradled her son in her arms. His breaths were small, uneven at times, but steady enough to calm her own racing heart. Her voice, quiet and trembling, filled the air with the faintest of songs, a lullaby, soft and broken, yet beautiful in its simplicity. "Hush now, my darling, the night will soon pass. The stars will watch over, the storm cannot last." Her voice wove through the silence, wrapping around the child like another blanket. Each word was not just a melody but a prayer, a plea to heaven to keep this fragile life safe. Thomas sat nearby, sharpening his axe. The rasp of metal against stone blended with the song. He didn't say much, he rarely did, but his eyes softened whenever Nancy sang. He knew the weight behind her voice. This wasn't just a mother's lullaby, it was a vow. Nancy had lost children before. Graves lay shallow in Kentucky soil, marked only by wooden crosses that leaned with the wind. Each loss had carved her soul, each silence had left her weaker. And yet, holding this child, she dared to believe again. Every time her voice rose into song, she poured all her brokenness into it, offering her son not just comfort, but her own fragile hope. The baby stirred. His eyes opened briefly, dark, searching, unfocused. And for a fleeting second, Nancy swore he looked at her, truly saw her. Her heart tightened. She leaned down, pressing her lips to his forehead. "You're stronger than you look, little one," she whispered between verses. "You must be. This world won't give you kindness, but you'll rise anyway." The fire cracked, sending sparks upward. Thomas lifted his gaze to the flame, then to Nancy. "Your singing," he said slowly, his voice rough from silence, "keeps him alive as much as the fire does." Nancy's eyes glistened, though she didn't stop rocking, didn't stop singing. "Maybe it keeps me alive too," she admitted. The day stretched on. Each night, when the forest pressed dark and heavy around them, Nancy sang. Sometimes she sang hymns her mother once sang to her. Sometimes she made up verses on the spot, words pulled from her heart in desperation. Each song became a thread stitching her fragile hope into the silence. One night, as the fire dimmed and Thomas dozed in his chair, Nancy sang more quietly than ever before. She rocked the child against her chest, feeling the fragile rise and fall of his breath. Her words trembled. "Sleep now, my darling, though shadows may fall. Your light will shine brighter, one day above all." Tears slipped down her cheeks, warm against her cold skin. She wasn't just singing to comfort her child. She was whispering her dream into him, a dream that he would grow beyond this cabin, beyond this wilderness, beyond the poverty that clung to them like frost on glass. In those moments, the lullaby wasn't just for him. It was for the man he would one day become. The baby whimpered, then stilled again. His tiny fist curled near her collarbone, gripping the fabric of her dress as though refusing to let go. Nancy held him tighter, her song softening to a hum. The cabin seemed to listen. The fire's crackle softened. The wind outside stilled for a moment, and even Thomas's steady breathing seemed to fall in rhythm with the lullaby. Years later, when Abraham Lincoln would recall his childhood, fragments of these songs would live in his memory. Not the words, perhaps, but the feeling. The warmth of a mother's voice against the backdrop of hardship. The sense that even in the bleakest night, someone believed in him. But for now, he was only a child, pressed against his mother's heart, lulled into sleep by the fragile strength of a woman who had already lost too much but refused to let go again. And so, in that tiny log cabin, under the weight of winter, the story of a nation's future leader was being sung into existence, one lullaby at a time. The woods around the sinking spring farm stretched endlessly, or at least they seemed to in the eyes of anyone who lived near them. Trees rose tall and bare in the winter, their branches like blackened veins against a pale, gray sky. In summer, they would thicken into green walls that swallowed sound. But in winter, they were skeletal and still, and when the wind blew, they groaned like restless ghosts. For Thomas Lincoln, the woods were a shield and a burden. He knew their paths, their hiding places, their dangers. He cut timber here, gathered firewood, hunted when food was scarce. But to little Abraham, the woods were something else entirely. Though he was only a baby now, pressed against Nancy's arms as she carried him near the edge of the trees, it was as though he was breathing in the silence that lived there, letting it settle into his bones. Nancy often walked near the woods when the baby was restless. Her steps left shallow prints in the thin snow, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her voice humming the songs that had already become a lifeline. The stillness of the forest seemed to answer her, not with words, but with a kind of listening that made her feel less alone. Sometimes Thomas would pause his work and watch her from a distance. He didn't say it, but he understood. Nancy carried grief in her heart like a shadow, and the silence of the woods gave her a place to set it down, even if only for a moment. The baby's small cries, the hush of her lullabies, the faint crunch of her footsteps, all of it became part of the rhythm of the trees. There were nights when the woods loomed darker than usual, when wolves howled in the distance and the wind bent branches until they creaked and splintered. Those were the nights Nancy stayed inside, clutching her son close as though shielding him from more than the cold. She knew these woods could be cruel, that within their silence lived hunger, predators, and a reminder of just how isolated they truly were. But there was also wonder here. In spring, the first green shoots would push through the soil near the cabin. Birds would return, their songs stitching music back into the silence. And Nancy, tired, worn, but still alive with hope, would point out these changes to Abraham as though telling him a story. "See, child," she would whisper, brushing his tiny hand against a budding branch. "Even in the hardest ground, life finds a way." The woods became his first classroom, long before letters and books. Though he wouldn't remember these earliest days, they imprinted on him. The way light shifted through the trees, the way silence carried lessons of patience, the way survival required respect for nature's rhythm. These truths settled quietly in his spirit. Thomas, too, brought him into the woods as soon as he could walk. The boy's small feet stumbled over roots, his hands clutching his father's calloused fingers. Thomas showed him how to listen, how to hear the crack of a branch and know whether it was a deer or a storm approaching, how to see the faint track of an animal in mud, how to read the forest like a book without words. And though Thomas was not a man of many speeches, his actions carried meaning. Each time he set the boy on a log, each time he pointed silently to a hawk circling above, each time he let him touch the rough bark of a tree, he was giving Abraham the tools of survival. Nancy added something else. In the hush of the woods, she told stories, biblical ones, fragments of old hymns, memories of her own childhood. Her voice filled the gaps the silence left. Abraham grew between the two influences, his father's quiet strength and his mother's gentle storytelling. The woods absorbed it all. It was in this silence that something invisible began to form within the boy. A stillness, a depth, a patience. He was learning not only how to survive poverty, but how to carry silence without fear. One day, this silence would become the foundation of his thoughtfulness, his ability to listen more than he spoke, his strength to pause before action. The cabin was his shelter, but the woods were his sanctuary. When storms rattled the roof, the trees stood firm. When hunger thinned their meals, the woods offered berries, roots, and game. When loneliness pressed heavy on Nancy's spirit, the woods listened. And so, even before he could speak in full sentences, Abraham Lincoln was absorbing the lessons of the silent woods, the lessons of patience, endurance, and the quiet strength that would one day steady him through the storms of a divided nation. The boy slept soundly that night after another long walk near the tree-line. Nancy laid him down beside the fire, pressing her lips to his forehead. The woods outside stood tall and still, their shadows stretching across the snow. Silent, eternal, waiting. They seemed to know, in a way no one else yet could, that within this fragile child lay the weight of something far greater than the forest itself. The fire was more than warmth in the Lincoln cabin. It was life itself. In the bitter cold of Kentucky winters, when the wind howled through cracks in the log walls and snow drifted at the door, the fire's glow was the only thing standing between survival and surrender. Its light flickered across rough-hewn timbers, painting shadows that danced across Nancy's weary face and Thomas's silent figure. For little Abraham, the fire became his first memory of wonder. At night, Nancy would lay her son close to the hearth. His small eyes, barely able to focus, would widen at the shifting colors, the deep orange core, the flaring yellow tongues, the brief blue sparks. To him, it was not just light. It was mystery, something alive, breathing and moving, yet never leaving its place. He would stretch out his tiny hand, fingers curling toward the glow, and Nancy would gently pull him back, whispering, "No, my child, fire gives and fire takes." That lesson lingered in the room long after her words faded. For Nancy, fire meant safety, a barrier against wolves, a shield against darkness. But it also meant danger. Just one stray spark could undo everything. She knew it, Thomas knew it. That fragile balance mirrored their lives. Hope and risk, comfort and loss, all contained within the same fragile flame. Thomas, practical as always, tended the fire like a craftsman. He chopped wood by day, stacking it neatly against the cabin wall, each log a promise of one more night's warmth. His hands were cracked and calloused, his body tired, but he never neglected the hearth. He knew without it, his family would not survive. The sound of his axe in the distance was as steady as a heartbeat, echoing through the still woods. Inside, Nancy turned the fire into something more. She sang softly while feeding the flames, her voice weaving through the crackle of burning wood. hymns, lullabies, fragments of scripture, all carried into Abraham's ears as he drifted to sleep in its glow. Firelight became the stage for her tenderness, the quiet rhythm of her hope. To her, every spark was a reminder that even in the hardest nights, light could be born from struggle. As Abraham grew, the firelight became his classroom. By its glow, Nancy showed him letters scratched on scraps of paper. By its glow, he listened to his father's stories about the land, the woods, the struggle of survival. By its glow, he watched shadows turn into shapes, learning that imagination could transform even bare walls into a world alive with meaning. The fire gave him not only warmth, but vision. He began to notice things most children his age never would. How the logs hissed when damp, how smoke curled and clung to the rafters, how fire ate away wood until nothing but ash remained. All things pass, Nancy told him once as she brushed the ash aside, her face solemn in the dim glow. But what matters, child, is what they give while they burn. Her words would echo far beyond the cabin, far beyond her lifetime, becoming part of the moral fabric that shaped his view of sacrifice and duty. There were moments of fear, too. One night, a log rolled from the hearth, embers scattering across the floor. Nancy leapt forward, smothering them with a rag, while Thomas steadied the log back into place. Abraham's heart raced in his tiny chest as he watched the sudden danger unfold. When silence returned and the fire was contained again, Nancy held him close and whispered, "See, my son, even what saves us can destroy us if we forget to watch." That duality, the power of creation and destruction, burned into him as surely as the fire burned into the wood. The fire also brought the family together. On nights when hunger made their stomachs ache, when the meal was nothing more than cornmeal mush or thin broth, they would sit close to the hearth. Thomas, usually quiet, would sometimes tell a tale from his past, about building a cabin, about working the land, about hardship and perseverance. Nancy, her voice soft but steady, would add verses of scripture, her words rising and falling with the flames. And Abraham, too young to speak much, listened, always listening, absorbing. In those moments, firelight wasn't just survival, it was unity. It turned poverty into a kind of richness, not of wealth, but of spirit. The family's bond glowed in the shadows, just as brightly as the flames themselves. Years later, when Abraham would sit by another fire, older now, taller, with lines already forming in his face, he would think back to those early flames. He would remember the lessons they carried, that light can emerge from darkness, that warmth is born of struggle, that even fragile sparks can keep hope alive in the harshest winters. The fire became a metaphor for everything he would come to believe about perseverance, sacrifice, and resilience. That night, as snow pressed against the cabin walls, Nancy hummed once more. The baby shifted, eyes catching the glow, his small hand rising again toward the flames. She pulled it back gently, smiling despite her exhaustion. "One day, my son," she whispered, "you'll carry your own fire into the world." The wind howled outside, but inside, the fire roared steady and strong, casting its golden light over the child who would one day bring his own light into a nation's darkest hours. The nights in the Kentucky wilderness were not quiet. They were alive with the symphony of nature. Wolves howled from distant ridges, owls called out into the stillness, and the trees groaned under the weight of winter winds. Yet, inside the Lincoln cabin, another sound rose above it all, the soft voice of Nancy Hanks Lincoln, singing lullabies to her son. Her voice was not polished or trained, but it carried something rarer, warmth that reached the soul. When she sang, the cabin no longer felt like a prison of logs. It became a sanctuary. Each note wrapped around little Abraham like a blanket, soothing him even when the wind clawed at the walls. For him, her songs were not just melodies. They were anchors, promises that even in a world of uncertainty, love would endure. Nancy sang old hymns she remembered from her own childhood, songs whispered in Kentucky churches, where voices rose together in fragile hope. She sang ballads carried over from generations, stories woven into melodies that spoke of love, loss, and faith. Her words drifted through the smoky air, mingling with the steady crackle of the fire. Sometimes, when her voice trembled with exhaustion, it was as if she poured the last of her strength into the tune. Thomas would sit nearby, sharpening a tool or mending a harness, pretending not to listen. But his rough eyes softened when Nancy sang. The songs reminded him of something he could never quite name, something gentler than the harsh labor of frontier life. He did not say it aloud, but he knew. These lullabies were keeping not just Abraham alive, but all of them. They kept despair at bay, gave rhythm to nights that might otherwise feel endless. For Abraham, lying swaddled in rough cloth, Nancy's lullabies were his first taste of beauty. He could not yet understand the words, but he felt the music, the way the notes lingered, the way her voice rose like a fragile bird daring to fly in the storm. He would listen until his eyes grew heavy, drifting into dreams shaped by her song. One night, as snow pressed heavier than usual against the cabin, Nancy's voice carried a hymn of faith. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound! She sang it softly, almost to herself, as if reminding her weary spirit of the same truth she offered her child. Abraham stirred, his tiny fingers curling toward her voice, as if reaching for it in the darkness. She bent close, pressing her lips to his forehead, whispering, "The world will be hard, my son, but remember, there is always grace." Her lullabies were not just music, they were lessons wrapped in melody. In them, Abraham heard courage, compassion, and the steady rhythm of hope. He did not yet know it, but those quiet songs were planting seeds in him, seeds that would one day grow into words spoken on battlefields and from podiums, words that would steady a nation in its darkest nights, just as her voice steadied him. Nancy often sang to drown her own fears. She worried about sickness, about wolves, about the hunger that sometimes gnawed at their small family. But when she sang, fear loosened its grip. She could almost believe the world was kinder than it seemed, that tomorrow would bring something better. In singing to Abraham, she was really singing to herself, reminding her own heart to keep faith. Sometimes, Thomas would put down his work and hum along quietly, his deep, rough tone blending with Nancy's softer voice. Those were rare moments when the cabin felt whole, when hardship gave way to harmony. The boy would look between them, his small chest rising and falling, his wide eyes reflecting the flicker of firelight and the music that filled the air. Years later, when Abraham Lincoln stood tall, withered by grief and war, he would remember those lullabies. He would recall the cadence of her voice, the way her songs carried more strength than her frail body ever could. And he would carry that music into his own words, into speeches that rose like hymns, into phrases that bound wounds and restored hope. But for now, he was just a child, wrapped in his mother's arms, rocked by her voice. The wilderness pressed in, cold and merciless, but inside that cabin, a mother's song carved out a pocket of peace. Nancy's lullaby became the heartbeat of the home, the unseen thread that tied them together. As she finished her song, her voice faded into the night. She looked down at her son, asleep now, his tiny chest rising and falling with steady breath. She smiled, though her eyes glistened with tears. She knew the world outside would test him. But tonight, under her song, he was safe. Tonight, hope had won. And so, in the midst of poverty and struggle, a future president learned his first lesson in resilience. Not through sermons or books, but through the tender lullabies of a mother who refused to let the darkness have the final word. The forest around the Lincoln's log cabin was not just land. It was a living presence. Towering oaks and maples stretched skyward like silent guardians, their branches etched black against the winter moon. In daylight, they swayed gently, whispering secrets through the wind. But at night, they became shadows, watchful, mysterious, and sometimes frightening. For little Abraham, cradled against his mother's chest, the forest was both cradle and threat. He could not yet speak, but even he seemed to sense its power. When the wolves howled from deep within the timber, his small body tensed. When owls screeched, he whimpered until Nancy's hand stroked his back. She whispered, "Hush now, my child. The forest is strong, but so are we." The Lincolns lived on the edge of survival. Each day, Thomas ventured into the woods with axe and determination. The crack of steel against bark echoed through the air, steady and relentless. He chopped not only for firewood but for survival, clearing patches for planting, fashioning beams to strengthen the cabin. Every tree felled was a small victory against the wilderness that threatened to consume them. But Thomas also knew respect. As he wiped sweat from his brow, he often paused to gaze at the towering trunks around him. The forest, after all, gave them life as much as it took. It would warm their nights, sheltered their heads, and offered berries and game. Without it, they would not last a season. With it, they might endure. Nancy, too, carried her own relationship with the forest. On days when hunger pressed hard and supplies ran low, she foraged along the tree line, gathering roots, herbs, and wild greens. She moved carefully, aware of snakes and thorns, her skirts brushing against damp leaves. She often spoke to the baby as she walked, telling him stories of the forest as if it were a grand cathedral built, not by men, but by God himself. "The trees," she whispered one afternoon, her voice soft as she held him close. "They grow tall because they reach for the light. Remember that, my son. Always reach upward, no matter how dark the ground may be." Abraham's infant eyes, wide and unblinking, followed the shafts of sunlight piercing through the branches above. Something inside him stirred, a sense, perhaps, that the world was larger than this cabin, larger than this forest. Winter deepened, and the forest grew harsher. Frozen branches cracked under the weight of ice, and the paths turned treacherous. Thomas had to walk farther for firewood, sometimes returning with hands raw and bleeding from frost. Yet every evening, when he laid the heavy logs beside the hearth, there was relief. The flames that roared to life were not just fire. They were proof of his battle with the forest and his victory for another day. For Abraham, the forest imprinted itself on his earliest memories. The rustle of leaves, the howl of beasts, the hush that settled like a blanket when snow fell heavy. These became part of him. The silence of the forest was not emptiness. It was a space where imagination could grow. Long before books found their way into his hands, the forest was his first teacher, its quiet urging him to listen, to observe, to wonder. At times, Nancy would carry him outside at dusk. The cold air stung, but she pulled him close, wrapping him in cloth as she pointed toward the dark line of trees. "Do you hear it, Abraham?" she asked, her breath forming small clouds in the air. "That's the sound of life, even when all seems still. Never mistake silence for nothingness. Sometimes, silence carries the greatest truths." These words, spoken softly into a winter night, were seeds of wisdom. Years later, when Lincoln would pause and thought before delivering a speech, when he would let silence speak as powerfully as words, it would echo back to this teaching, this understanding that stillness can hold meaning. But in the present, the silent forest loomed as both provider and predator. One night, the family awoke to the cry of wolves circling too close. The sound raised gooseflesh on Nancy's arms. Thomas grabbed his rifle, his face grim, and stood by the door, listening to the low growls just beyond the logs. Inside, Nancy clutched her son tighter, rocking him, her heart pounding with each sound. The forest tested them, reminded them of how fragile their lives were. Yet dawn always came. The wolves moved on. The trees stood tall, and the family endured. Abraham, though too young to understand, absorbed it all. The tension, the fear, the relief. In those first fragile years, the forest became the backdrop of his becoming. It taught his parents endurance, and through them, it planted resilience in him. The silent forest, with all its shadows and stillness, was shaping a boy who would one day step from its edges into the vast light of history. The hush of those trees, the patience they embodied, would live on in the man who would stand steady while a nation tore itself apart. And so, each night as the wind moved through the branches, the forest whispered to the boy in the cradle, not words, but lessons. Be still. Be strong. Endure. The crack of an axe against wood echoed across the Kentucky clearing, steady and unrelenting, like a heartbeat of survival. Each strike was a reminder that Thomas Lincoln carried the weight of his family's world on his shoulders. His hands were blistered, his muscles sore, but still he swung, splitting logs with the determination of a man who knew that weakness was not an option. The burden of fatherhood here was not abstract. It was carved into his palms, etched into the lines of his face, and measured in the calluses that thickened with each passing day. Life on the frontier was not forgiving. The log cabin where his family huddled at night was no fortress. It was fragile wood against the endless wild. Wolves prowled nearby, storms tore at the roof, and hunger gnawed constantly. To protect his wife Nancy and their newborn son Abraham, Thomas had to provide. There was no safety net, no community to catch them if he faltered. He was the shield, the provider, the sole line between his family and the void of wilderness. Each morning, before the sun fully rose, he woke to the silence of the forest and the cries of his son. The baby's small voice was both fragile and commanding, a reminder that his work had purpose. When he stepped outside into the cold, his breath visible in the sharp air, he carried that purpose like armor. He knew what failure meant, not just disappointment, but starvation, exposure, even death. He built and rebuilt with his own two hands, strengthening the cabin walls, fashioning crude furniture, patching leaks with mud and clay. The cabin wasn't much, but for Thomas it was proof of his struggle, his love made visible in wood and stone. Each plank nailed into place was a promise to his family. I will not let you fall. But burden is never just physical. It pressed into his mind as well. Thomas had grown up in hardship, had seen what neglect and poverty could do to a man. Now, as he watched his infant son staring up at the flickering firelight, he wrestled with a fear he could not speak aloud. Would Abraham inherit only struggle? Would he too be bound by the chains of poverty and labor? Sometimes, when exhaustion overtook him, Thomas sat quietly by the fire and studied the boy's face. The child's wide eyes seemed almost too knowing, too deep for his age. Thomas would whisper under his breath, "You deserve more, son. More than this." The words hung in the smoky air, fragile confessions from a man who rarely spoke of dreams. Yet the wilderness allowed no time for long reflection. There was always another tree to cut, another patch of ground to clear, another threat to face. Once, after days of relentless rain, the nearby creek swelled, threatening to flood their small plot. Thomas worked through the storm, stacking stones, digging trenches, his clothes soaked through, his body shivering. When at last the waters receded, he collapsed near the door of the cabin, his chest heaving. Inside, Nancy placed Abraham in his arms, and in that moment, burden became blessing. Holding his son, Thomas found strength again. At night, when the forest grew restless and the wind howled, he kept his rifle close. He knew he could not stop every danger, but he would die before letting it touch his family. That silent oath lived in his every movement, the way he patrolled the perimeter, the way he fixed every crack in the cabin walls, the way he hunted even when his legs ached. His burden was heavy, but it was also sacred, and little Abraham, though still swaddled and wordless, was absorbing it all. He saw his father's hands, rough and scarred, yet gentle when they held him. He heard the steady rhythm of axe against wood, a sound that would stay with him, a symbol of persistence. He felt the weight of love disguised as labor, the unspoken truth that fatherhood is sacrifice. The forest, harsh and indifferent, pressed in on the Lincoln family. But inside that small cabin, Thomas's burden transformed into resilience. His toil lit the fire that kept him alive. His sacrifice carved out a fragile space where his son could grow. Years later, when Abraham Lincoln carried the burden of a divided nation, perhaps he remembered this. The sight of his father's sweat dripping into the soil, the sound of axe and hammer ringing into the dawn, the quiet determination of a man who bore his struggles without complaint. In the silence of Kentucky's wilderness, a boy learned, without words, that greatness is built on sacrifice, and that every burden carried with love can become the foundation for something far greater than survival. And so the cabin stood, small, weathered, imperfect, but strong enough to shelter a family because one man carried the weight. Thomas Lincoln's burden was heavy, yes, but in its heaviness, it carried the promise of destiny. The night in the Kentucky wilderness was deep, silent, and almost sacred. The stars above stretched endless, scattered like fragments of a dream across the black canvas of the sky. Inside the small log cabin, a faint fire flickered, shadows dancing along rough wooden walls. The room smelled of wood smoke and earth, a reminder of the world they lived in, raw, unforgiving, yet strangely beautiful. Nancy Hanks Lincoln, weary from a long day, knelt by the side of the crude wooden cradle. The flicker of firelight kissed her tired face, revealing lines far too deep for her age. Her body bore the marks of hard living, of endless toil and hunger, but her eyes, soft, luminous, rested on the small form swaddled before her. Abraham, her son, her fragile hope in the wilderness, slept soundly. His tiny chest rose and fell, each breath fragile but steady. Nancy clasped her hands together. She was not a woman of many luxuries, but she was a woman of faith. In the silence of the cabin, she prayed, not with grand words, not with polished sermons, but with the simple, desperate sincerity of a mother who knew hardship too well. "Lord," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm, "this child, this boy of mine, give him strength where this world gives him none. Give him wisdom where we can give him little. Let him carry a light that this wilderness cannot dim." Her words melted into the crackling of the fire, as though carried upward by the smoke curling into the rafters. She prayed not only for her son's survival, but for something deeper, for destiny. Though she could not name it, she felt it. There was something in Abraham's gaze, even as a baby, something quiet and searching, something that seemed too vast for their small cabin, too infinite for the boundaries of the wilderness. She reached down, smoothing the thin blanket over him, her hand trembling slightly. The burden of motherhood in those times was not merely to love, but to fight against despair. She knew children were lost easily out here, disease, hunger, cold. They claimed lives swiftly and mercilessly. Each prayer was also a plea against those shadows. Thomas, her husband, lay resting on the other side of the cabin, his body spent from another day of endless labor. Nancy looked at him, then back at Abraham. Between them, she saw the truth of their lives, a man's sacrifice, a woman's faith, and a child's fragile promise. A gust of wind rattled the thin cabin walls, and Nancy pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She whispered again, this time softer, as though speaking only to the child. "You are more than this, Abe. Someday, you'll step beyond these woods. Someday, your words will matter. Someday, this hard life will not define you, it will shape you." Her voice broke, but she pressed on. She prayed that her son would inherit not just survival, but courage, not just strength, but compassion. She prayed that the hunger in their cabin would turn into a hunger for justice, that the cold nights would teach him endurance, that the loneliness of the frontier would plant in him the seeds of empathy. And so she prayed on, long after the fire dwindled, long after fatigue urged her to sleep. Each whispered word was a gift laid at her son's feet, unseen but powerful. Each tear shed was a vow that her son would never face the wilderness alone, not truly, for her prayers would follow him wherever he went. In that small cabin, on that quiet Kentucky night, history was being written, not in books, not in speeches, but in the unseen strength of a mother's faith. Nancy could not know that her son would one day carry a nation on his shoulders. She could not see that his words would echo across centuries, freeing the enslaved, uniting the divided. She only knew what every mother knows, that hope begins small, fragile, and hidden, but when nurtured, it can grow into something mighty. She pressed her lips gently to the baby's forehead, lingering there, whispering one final prayer. God, let him be a light in this dark world. And as the boy stirred faintly in his sleep, the wind outside softened. The cabin, fragile and small, seemed for a moment like the center of the universe, where burden, faith, and destiny met. A mother's prayer had been spoken, and though unseen, it would travel with Abraham Lincoln for the rest of his life. When we look at Abraham Lincoln's journey from a log cabin to the White House, there are powerful words we can learn not only as vocabulary, but as life lessons. Sparkles resilience. This word means the ability to recover from difficulties. Lincoln's entire life was a story of resilience. Even when life pushed him down, he stood back up. Repeat after me. Resilience. Sparkles, humble beginnings. This phrase means starting from a simple, poor, or low position in life. Lincoln's story is the perfect example. He came from humble beginnings, yet rose to greatness. Sparkles against all odds. This expression means succeeding even when the chances are very low. Lincoln's success was against all odds because everything, poverty, loss, and failure, stood in his way. Sparkle's legacy. A legacy is what you leave behind for the world. Lincoln's legacy is not just his presidency, but his vision of freedom and unity. Sparkle's faith and perseverance. Faith means trust or belief, and perseverance means never giving up. These two qualities carried Lincoln from the cabin to the Capitol. So when you practice these words, resilience, humble beginnings, against all odds, legacy, faith, perseverance, you are not just learning English. You are learning the language of success. Your starting point does not define your future. Lincoln's cabin was small, but his dreams were limitless. Keycap 2 hardship can be your greatest teacher. Poverty, loss, and failure shaped his character into steel. Keycap 3 keep faith in yourself, even when no one else does. Lincoln believed in his purpose before the world recognized it. Keycap 4 use failure as fuel, not as chains. Every rejection Lincoln faced only sharpened his determination. Keycap 5 leave behind a legacy, not excuses. What you build today will outlive you tomorrow. So, the next time you feel small, the next time you think the odds are stacked against you, remember this. Abraham Lincoln was once just a barefoot boy in a broken cabin, but he carried inside him a fire, a belief that life could be more than survival. That fire became words, those words became action, and those actions reshaped a nation. Your cabin may look different. Your struggles may not be his, but the truth remains the same. Greatness is not about where you begin. It is about how far you're willing to go. So rise up, stand tall, speak your words, fight your battles, and when the world asks who you are, let your life answer louder than your fears. Because somewhere in you, just like in that little boy from Kentucky, there's a president waiting to be born.